Well, good morning. I appear to have frozen. What's going on? Right, there I am. I seem to be back again. Hopefully, going out loud and clear this morning. It's Sunday. I never know what day of the week it is, do I? It's Sunday. It's 14th of November. It's show 188. It's a fairly miserable grey day here in London. We're certainly looking more and more autumnal with every day at the moment. Though the trees are still remarkably green outside, they are finally starting to show signs of yellowing. So there are leaves all over the place. Right, so what have we got for you today in Elevenses? Former Norton boss Stuart Garner's court date has been put back to next year. Stroud police in Gloucestershire have seized a brand new bike from the rider. Benda, Chinese manufacturer, are showing off a pair of V4 motors. We'll be looking at a new lithium-carbon battery technology and asking if it's the electrical breakthrough we've been waiting for. And linked to that, we'll be looking at why there is a microchip shortage. And finally, today's better biking tip, I'll be talking rider psychology. Actually, I'll be talking bias and specifically the illusion of control. So settle yourself down. Don't forget, you can ask a question, you can drop me a comment, anything you want to say, basically. I will try to get back to you during the show if I possibly can. If I can't make it during the show, I will respond afterwards when I come off air. So do anything you've got to say, I'll try to get back to you on that one. Right, okay, so first piece of news then. In a week when the newly incarnated Norton motorcycles have revealed their brand new state-of-the-art headquarters in Solihull, it's actually been opened. You can do a sort of virtual tour of the new facility. It re-establishes their historic partnership with the West Midlands town, but less attractively, their former boss Stuart Garner has had his court date put back. Now, you'll recall that Stuart Garner was actually the boss of the former incarnation of Norton before it was taken over by the Indian concern TVS. And he's been accused of illegally investing people's pension savings into the company itself, whilst it was under his ownership, of course. And he was due to appear at Southern Derbyshire Magistrates Court tomorrow, Monday, November the 15th. But his court date has now been deferred till Monday, February the 7th. 2022. There was no obvious reason for that, no explanation for that decision. Anyway, he's accused of breaching employer-related investment (ERI) rules by illegally investing more than 5% of the assets from each of 3 pension schemes that were set up by Norton Motorcycle Holdings between 2012 and 2013, and he was the sole trustee for those schemes, and there were 227 scheme members affected according to the pensions regulator, and I believe they're still waiting to get their money back. Second piece of news today. It's always tempting to take a bike for a short ride, even if you don't have the correct documentation, but it's a temptation that we really should avoid, as the owner of a new bike in Gloucester discovered this week. It's actually a very bad idea. What went wrong? Well, Stroud police tweeted that the bike in the photo there was being misused in Nailsworth near Stroud. And when the rider was stopped, he was found to be riding minus insurance and without a tax disc. So that's road and excise license to the police, tax disc are you and me. As a result, his machine there, which you can see as Zontes, was promptly seized by the local neighbourhood police team. And they went online and tweeted that the owner can get it back when he's proven it's taxed and insured. The trouble is, of course, he may have discovered that he's made himself more expensive to insure, because I suspect it's also likely that he'll end up with a fine up to a maximum of £300 for riding without insurance, and there's a at least 6 penalty point that goes with it as well. So that's bad news. It could get worse. Well, it will get worse because he will have to pay a fine and road tax. On top of that, there'll be back road tax to pay. And I assume there'll also be fees to retrieve the bike from the police pound, although that wasn't stated in the tweet either. Could all have been a lot worse, of course. If the case goes to court, the penalty could be an unlimited fine and disqualification. And here's the really bad news. If you are caught uninsured on a motorcycle, the police do actually have the power to seize and destroy the vehicle. So that's a lot of chances to take riding uninsured just for a bit of fun. Okay, I'll also remind you while I've got the picture up on screen, and I'll leap forward to the next one. There it is, that Science of Being Seen is going out again on the first Wednesday in December. I've managed to lose the date. I've forgotten what the date is, but I'm sure you can work it out for yourself. It's first Wednesday in December. It's 8 p.m. The login details for that are on the header for this show, so do pop over if you can. As I've explained, Science of Being Seen has now been dropped by the fire services from Biker Down, basically because they increasingly wanting to keep everything in-house, because Biker Down is now run by the Fire Chiefs Association. Previously, it was run by individual fire services. So I'm still keen to keep Science of Being Seen in the public eye, as I think it's absolutely vital for all riders to gain some insights into the all too common Smidsy collision. So even if you've seen Science of Being Seen yourself, please, please, please do pass the word on to friends and family who ride, even to car drivers that you know, because there is a lot of information in Science of Being Seen which is directly relevant to drivers. So please pass on that information if you possibly can. Good morning, James. James has looked in and said hello. Nice to see you again. Right, so what else is in the news? Well, a few decades ago, you may recall that Honda produced a line of V4s, and for a while it did look as if the V4 engine was about to take over from the inline four as the definitive Japanese engine design. Honda actually launched an entire range of them, all the way up from the baby VF 400F, a bike my brother actually owned, which I did like. I thought it was a very nice little bike. And the pundits at the time did actually anticipate that everybody else would follow suit. Well, they didn't actually. There was the odd bike, the VMAX springs to mind. And it was probably the cost and complexity of building these engines that actually deterred most of the other manufacturers. So the V4 pretty much stayed Honda's baby for many years. It did, however, power some really classic motorcycles with the wing on the tank. The VFR 750-800 range is, I suppose, is rightly described as iconic. And then there are the track-ready RC30, RC45 bikes. I would have loved an RC30 in the garage. Even in 2021, the motor effectively lives on in the long-running VFR 800 and the VFR 1200. I can't remember the last time I saw either of those brand new on the road, though. Equally rare are Aprilia's RSV4 and Ducato's Desmo Sedici, which are their own take on V4 engines, neither of which are exactly aiming at the affordable end of the market. So you may be surprised or intrigued, perhaps, to discover that Chinese brand Benda plans to introduce 2 such machines next year. Slightly unfortunate name, really, I think, but hey-ho. Now, some months ago, I did show you a pair of 680cc inline 4s, and they're a couple of 700cc bikes, basically, from the company, which are out and about. But they've now shown a pair of the V4 engines at a recent motorcycle show in Guangdong in China. Now, just to start with the basics, both of the motors share many common design elements. They're water cooled, they're 70-degree V4s, they're double overhead cam cylinder heads, and they are both 16 valves. Interestingly, they share two throttle bodies, so the 4 inlet ports get their feed via a couple of Siamese inlet manifolds. So that there is the 1200 unit. Let's zoom in a little bit on it, show it to you. Here it comes. Right, there we are. That's the V4 motor. The Siamese inlet manifolds are generally seen as something that saps performance, so it's not something you'd see in an out-and-out sportsback engine. But nevertheless, the 1200 there does have more than 150 horsepower claimed for it at a reasonably low 9,500 RPM. And you get a fairly stonking 89 foot-pounds of torque coming in at 7,500. So that would make it, without doubt, the most powerful Chinese motorcycle we've seen to date. And those sort of figures, whilst probably a bit short on the sports bike level, would certainly make it a sort of a power cruiser or a big tourer fairly handily. It's interesting that the 76mm bore and 66mm stroke are actually identical to the original VMAX, but it's not a clone of that engine, even if there are other similarities. Clones, of course, being something that early Chinese motorcycles were notorious for being. So what about the 500? Well, you're probably struggling to spot the difference, really, aren't you? Because basically it's almost identical externally to the bigger unit you've just seen. What it does have, though, are slightly under square dimensions, which is interesting. A 55.2mm stroke is mated to a 53.5mm bore, so it's very slightly under square. Now, most motorcycles these days are the other way round, the short stroke, long, wide bore, which means the piston speed can be higher and you basically get more power, bigger bang out of the engine. So it's not going to be a power or rev monster, and that's shown in the figures of 56 horsepower at 10,000 RPM and 33 foot-pounds of torque at 8,000 RPM. Well, if I remember right, that's pretty similar to the original VFR or VF 500. So word from Benda is that we'll actually see these engines appearing in real bikes at some point next year. When they'll appear here is hard to say. But Benda do have their own nascent European distributor network, so it is likely they will appear in Europe and probably in the UK at some point. Now, here's the really interesting bit. Rather like the modular Triumphs, one magazine has speculated that there will be parts in common to both motors, and something they picked up on is that the short 55.2mm stroke from the 496 baby engine, mate that with the 76mm bore of the bigger engine, and you get 1000 cc's. And what they suggest is this could indicate that Benda actually have plans to produce a higher revving and more performance-oriented litre motor in the future. So here's my speculation. What if that engine goes into a sports bike? And what if that sports bike is destined for World Superbike competition? We know we've got rounds of the World Championships going out to China. So it's only a matter of time before a genuinely Chinese engined bike is actually competing. And World Superbikes would be the obvious choice because they are road bikes, as you know, which have been, well, tarted up, I suppose, to be turned into races. Quite a lot of work goes into a World Superbike, but essentially there is somewhere in the beating heart of that bike a road bike. And so World Superbikes would actually make a pretty good showcase for a Chinese engine and a Chinese bike if it could be competitive and reliable. Talking of competitive and reliable, what about Mahler Powertrain and Allotrope Energy's breakthrough in battery technology? Now, if you've been following my regular looks at electric motorcycles, you'll know that one of the problems with them is range. However expensive the bike, there's simply a physical limit to the amount of battery that can be squeezed in between two wheels. And that limits effectively the power output and range. You can either have lots of range and relatively little power, or you can have lots of power and relatively little range. Matching the two together is the sort of the holy grail. And although there have been some bikes promised with ludicrous power outputs and ludicrous ranges, we've not actually seen those in real life. And even at the TT, bikes are still struggling to get around the 37.75 mile course on a one tank of electricity, as it were. So the Mahler Powertrain Allotrope Energy story is a really interesting one, because what they are saying is that their new lithium-carbon battery technology enables ultra-fast charging and good power density. So how fast actually is it? Well, the press release promises that the combination of supercapacitors and traditional lithium-ion batteries, the lithium-carbon technology enables a full charge to be delivered in a similar time to fueling an internal combustion vehicle. The design is also said to result in a battery cell that suffers none of the thermal degradation effects experienced by traditional lithium-based batteries. As you probably notice, when you put a lithium battery in a charger, it gets hot. So it's this thermal stability plus a tolerance of high temperatures that permits a high current delivery and fast charging. And it means you don't need to resort to complex external cooling or elaborate battery management systems of the kind that you'll find on most electric vehicles at the moment. Now, right at the moment, this is still in sort of proof of pudding stage, because Allotrope Energy and Mahler Powertrain are looking at the urban food delivery bike as a potential market. And what they're touting basically is an inexpensive small capacity lithium carbon battery with a 25-kilometer range. Now, it doesn't sound much, but the whole point of this is it could be recharged in as little as 90 seconds. Now, the conventional lithium-ion battery would need to be about 500 watt hours in size. And even a tiny battery like that would either require a battery swap out at a swap station of the sort I was talking about last week, actually, with the story from Kikasa, or it would require a fast charge recharge mid-shift for the average rider, and that would take them out of action for about 30 minutes plus. So the idea that you can get the energy density and ultra-fast charging is very attractive, not just for the food delivery industry, but also for bigger vehicles too. Now, Dr. Mike Bassett, who's Mahler Powertrain's head of research, says range anxiety is often quoted as the main barrier to electric vehicle adoption. But if the battery could be charged in the same time it takes to refuel a conventional internal combustion vehicle, that much of that worry goes away. So frankly, if you could plug your touring bike or your car into an ultra fast charger with one of these batteries and get a top up in 3 to 4 minutes, it also takes away the need to have a battery which delivers hundreds of miles of range on the tank too. If you think about it, virtually all the journeys that we do in vehicles like this are less than 100 miles. Many of them are single digit figures. But occasionally we do need to go long distance, and that's where the current crop of electric vehicles tends to fall down. I test rode the Zeros a couple of years ago, and whilst I was very impressed with them, I do need a guaranteed range of 150 miles to get to a training course, to run the training course and get back again. And at the moment, the Zeros don't quite get there. They're nearly there, but no, just a bit short. But if I could refuel the bike by plugging it into an ultra fast charger and get a full tank, as it were, in 3 or 4 minutes, then game over for me. That's fine. I would be perfectly happy to do that as long as I could find a charging point, of course. So the need to do lots of miles on a fully charged electric bike also goes away, which means you can use lighter, cheaper batteries in the bikes. And here's the even better good news. Now, these lithium-carbon batteries, they are also claimed to have a much longer life in terms of charging cycles. Typically, you're hearing figures of 3,000 to maybe 10,000 charging cycles for lithium-ion batteries. The new lithium carbon is claimed to survive 100,000 plus charging cycles. That'll be way in excess of the vehicle's lifetime. If you think about 100,000 days, even 2 charges a day, you're looking at way over 10 years. And that means less waste from batteries which have reached the end of life cycle. And the battery in construction is also said to be free from rare earth metals, which means that they are both more environmentally friendly when they're being made, and they're also fully recyclable. So there's a lot of good to be said for these batteries if they hit production. So keep an eye open for that technology. That's lithium carbon, and we'll see how that one goes. Right, so don't forget, if you want to catch up with these shows, set yourself a reminder. They go out every Wednesday and Sunday at 11 here on Facebook. You'll also find them uploaded to YouTube in sort of an hour or so, and you can catch up with all the old shows there on YouTube as well. You can find them here on Facebook, but it's a bit more difficult, so easier to get them on YouTube. And you'll also find a link on my Ko-fi page as well to the YouTube one, so do come along and catch up if you miss it live. Right, now sort of with a bit of a link to the previous story, one of the problems with electric vehicles, with any vehicles at the moment, is shortage of chips. Yes, not the deep fried version, but the semiconductor. My brother's laptop actually is giving up the ghost, and he's been looking for a new one, and he's been horrified at how much they've gone up in price just recently. And he probably also noticed that bikes, as well as cars and vans, have all increased in price because there are shortages. And it's not just the weakness of the pound, it's not just Brexit, it's not just COVID and supply chain issues. There's actually a semiconductor chip shortage. And though the world has been getting back to something approaching normal, supply is not catching up with demand. And that is at least partly because there is an ever-growing demand for the chips. So why is that? Well, partly it's down to the range of things that need chips. Modern bike with all the electronic aids, the digital dash, the LCD lights and everything else that's become common in the last few years now needs quite a few microchips. If you compare and contrast that to something like my CB250 RS built 40 years ago, there's not a microchip in the thing. It's all entirely electromechanical. And of course, the PC I'm on right now also needs chips. They're also in my not very smart phone. But the real demand, which is causing problems, is coming from the so-called Internet of Things, where items like your otherwise mundane water filter is connected to the internet, so it can reorder a new filter for you when it's needed without you having to intervene. More and more gadgets are being connected to the internet. More and more gadgets talk to each other, and they all need microchips, and so demand is actually outstripping supply. Why is that? Well, the answer turns out to be rather interesting. It's because whilst demand can easily go up because people can build the chips into gadgets very, very easily, making the chips themselves turns out not to be. Even the older chips, the ones that have been around for 10 years or more, which are still being used in many less critical applications, they need complex machinery to build. They need highly trained operators, and they need technologically advanced production facilities. And it takes time to build new machines, to train workers, and to equip a new factory. The newest chips are getting increasingly complex, and one of the very latest chips, the thing you're likely to find in the newest iPhone, could well take 1,000 operations of a machine to build. And then the failure rate is actually quite high too. So basically, it's a chip shortage which has caused prices to spin out of control. And it's not just affecting the price of chips either. Apparently, a chip manufacturing machine built in 1995 and still in use today would have been worth $100,000 in 2014 when it was 20 odd years old. It's currently selling for 1.7 million, would you believe? So it's gone up in price almost 20 times. So with older equipment ballooning in price, basically in a huge wait list for new equipment, we're not going to see the shortage of chips solved anytime soon. Right, okay, so as you probably know, I'm always fairly interested in security. This was the item I meant to bring you last time out, but I lost the picture. Good, well-secured bike is a good thing, and of course my background in ecology means I'm always happy to see environmentally friendly and biodegradable options. So perhaps that's the new way of locking your bike up. Build a fence around it. What do you think? Anybody else got any interesting stories about abandoned bikes like that one there? Let me know. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that too. Right, okay, so on to the final bit of today's show. It's the better biking discussion, and this all goes back to an item I put up on the Facebook page on Saturday. You can also find it over on my coffee page if you head over there. Basically, the statement was, done right, overtaking is perfectly safe. Now, this was actually said by a retired police rider, former member of the Met Special Escort Group, actually, on a bike forum some years back, where I moderated the survival skills section. And he was working for training school at the time, and he made this contribution to discussion on overtaking. Now, as I said on Saturday, I'm sure regulars here will know me well enough to have a fair idea of how I thought about that statement. Because the problem is, of course, that if we assume that if we do everything right, nothing can go wrong, we're assuming that everything that could happen is under our direct control, and that anything we can't control is perfectly predictable. Now, quite frankly, at the moment we get on a bike, we should expose the flaw in that reasoning. Basically, the perfect overtake is a myth. It's simply one that goes right is simply one where the variables that weren't under our control stayed within those limits that we predicted. So if we're going to make an overtake, what we actually have to do is we have to run through an analysis of things that could go wrong. If we can ask ourselves, what are the chances that the driver we're about to overtake will do something we don't want them to do, then we have a better chance of making an overtake in a relatively low risk situation and ruling out the overtakes where it turns out the driver doesn't follow the rules that should apply to them, such as looking in a mirror before they turn. Now, it wasn't too surprising, and despite my logical explanation of the variables, the very first comment was, what you can do is minimize the risks to an almost insignificant level by techniques like giving stationary objects a bit more space, not overtaking as you're approaching junctions and blind spots, or watching the behavior of the drivers ahead. So yeah, in the real world, I'd say Jon ex-copper is right. Well, I'd still say he's wrong. Firstly, let's see why it is on a risk-based basis. My critic there said you can reduce risks to an almost insignificant level. Well, what is risk? Well, it's the chance of something going wrong times the impact on us when it happens. That's a very, very simple and easy to apply definition of risk. So it should be fairly obvious that something can be high risk even if it doesn't happen very often. Now, what do we know about overtaking? Well, overtaking accidents are actually a considerable contributor to the fatal casualties in the UK, something like 50% in some regions of the UK. And the critical thing to understand about an overtake is that it might not go wrong very often, but if it does go wrong, the impact on us is actually catastrophic. And that's what makes overtaking very high risk. Even if all our previous overtakes have gone right, we only have to get one overtake wrong for it to be the last overtake we ever get wrong. And that's the bit that people tend to fail to understand. Now, compare and contrast that with junction collisions. Yes, 100 riders every year die in junction collisions. We know that because it's in the statistics, and we know that 1,000 or so are injured badly enough to appear in those statistics too. But many overtaking junction collisions actually go unreported because they are just minor bumps. I can report one myself from the early days of my motorcycling career. I'd almost but not quite stopped. I was traveling at less than walking pace and the bike just toppled over sideways. I was unhurt. The bike was virtually undamaged. The car was virtually undamaged. We just sort of looked at our respective damage, shook our heads and shrugged our shoulders and both rode off again. But many riders don't understand the difference. And it's the stats that people see, the 100 dead, 1,000 injured, that makes people convinced it's blind drivers who kill riders. But think back to that risk equation, the opportunity, the chance of something happening versus the impact. There are many chances for things to go wrong in terms of junction collisions, and relatively little impact for most riders when it does happen. There are relatively few fatal crashes, all things considered, when you tot up the number of junctions. But compared with that, we make very few overtakes. You may think you're overtaking all the time, but if you actually think about all the driveways that you passed, all the farm fields, all the side turnings that you go past, and you compare and contrast, you'll find that you do many fewer overtakes than you pass places where a vehicle can pull out. So the risk factor for overtaking is actually high, simply because the impact is so high when it does go wrong. And this brings us on to what is called the illusion of control. Now, as I wrote in the comment section, people who think they're in control of events may be more likely to engage in risky behaviors. Because they think they're controlling what happens through their own actions, they also assume they will prevent any negative outcomes, which sounds very much like my critic's approach to overtaking, where he said, basically, if you do everything right, there's nothing much that can go wrong. So why does this illusion happen? Well, one reason is that because people mistake random chance for skill. As I said, we don't have very many fatal crashes on motorcycles. In terms of you and me, we'll have one each if we are unlucky enough to kill ourselves riding a motorcycle. Even across the entire population, there are only something like 350 fatal motorcycle crashes in something like 1.3, 1.4 million motorcyclists, all traveling sort of 3 billion miles a year. So remember, things really don't go wrong very often. And so we believe that it's our actions controlling our exposure to risk rather than the low actual eventuality of things going wrong being in control. So this is what's known as a cognitive bias. It's an error in the way that we think and we process information. And the trouble is, it can lead to erroneous beliefs, such as this idea that if you get everything right in an overtake, nothing can go wrong. And that means faulty decisions. We start taking overtakes where we are taking a significant risk, but without really thinking through what we're doing. Okay, probably scared you off now with talking about cognitive biases there, but it's something we really should be aware of. Many cognitive biases, as I say, are simple logic faults, but others are down to sort of groupthink. And I'll come back to that in the next show, but one. So next Sunday, I'll be coming back to this problem of cognitive biases and why we actually misjudge judge the risks of riding motorcycles. So I hope you've enjoyed that little exposition into psychology. Got a couple of comments here. James Blythe says, presumably new chip machines need new chips too. Yes, I dare say they do. Nick's just given me a hand clap, I think, there. Frequency versus magnitude describes fatal outcomes, says Terry. Yes, that's what I basically said, chance versus impact. So, yes. Well, I'll basically just leave you with the thought that, you know, we have to rethink how we ride bikes, really. This is never a simple decision that we have to make, but, you know, it's not one to be scared of, but it is something to be aware of. Right, okay, that is pretty much it for today. I shall wrap up. Don't forget, I am still running training courses out on the roads here on fine days. It's dryish at the moment. I don't know if it's going to stay dry today, but do drop me a line if you are still interested in doing some training. And of course, if you can't make it out on the road, you can always do one of my online training sessions. An hour gets you anything you want to talk about, basically. Whether you have a question you want to pose me, or you want me to explain my approach to a particular part of riding, drop me a line. I can run those for you pretty much any time. And yeah, science are being seen. Wednesday, 1st of December, of course, is the next webcast, and one after that we'll look at filtering in January. So that's it for another show. Take it easy out there. Do stay shiny side up if you are out and about on your bike, and enjoy the rest of your day. So thanks for looking in. From Kevin Williams of Survival Skills and 11s. That's it for today. See you on Wednesday.